Welcome, everybody, to Archaeology of Connecticut. Here is your state archaeologist, Sarah Sportman.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to our January show of the Archaeology of Connecticut. I'm the state archaeologist, Sarah Sportman, and I'm here tonight with my co-host, Scott Brady, the president of the Friends of the Office of State Archaeology. And our special guest tonight, Dr. Gary Aronson, a research associate and supervisor of the Yale Biological Anthropology Laboratory. Tonight we're going to talk about forensic archaeology with a focus on a recent project involving 4 burials that were inadvertently disturbed during renovations at Yale-New Haven Hospital in 2011. The 4 adult burials, now known as the Yale-New Haven 4, turned out to be burials from a 19th century Catholic cemetery that was lost to memory. The researchers, led by Dr. Aronson, carried out a multidisciplinary analysis of the remains, including osteological and radiographic analyses of the skeletons, nuclear and mitochondrial DNA analyses, isotopic analyses, and historical research. They were able to learn a tremendous amount of information about the lives of these 4 people, their identities, their health, and there were also some really interesting surprises. So before we get into the project, I'd like to introduce our guest, Dr. Gary Aronson, and talk a little bit about his work. So, Gary, thank you and welcome to the show tonight. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself, your work, and your involvement in Connecticut archaeology?
Sure thing. Thank you very much, Sarah and Scott, for having me on your show. I really appreciate it. The short version of my story is that I'm a kid who grew up in Brooklyn, New York, and I've always been fascinated with museums and science. And basically, I guess you can see it as one way of a kid who never really grew out of that. And so I spent my career doing anthropology, excavations, and working on aspects of biological anthropology, evolutionary ecology, and as we'll talk about in some detail today, osteology, and what bones can tell us. I've been fortunate to work in places like New York City, Alaska, and in several nations in Africa as well. It's a real pleasure to be here, and I'm happy to talk about some of the work that we do in our laboratory.
Great, thanks. Can you tell me a little bit, just tell us a little bit about, your role in Connecticut archaeology? I know that, you've often worked with some of my predecessors in the Office of State Archaeology on projects when human remains are inadvertently discovered. How do you end up involved in those projects?
Well, as you had pointed out, I work at the Yale University Biological Anthropology Laboratory. And so one of the things that happens for somebody like myself, and a joke I often make with students and colleagues, is that people like myself spend an awful lot of time looking at both whole bones and then fragments of bones, ostensibly because, especially for those of us that work in the fossil record, it's relatively uncommon to find a complete or whole skeletal element. And so because of the fact that people like me spend hours and hours looking at museum collections or being in the field and finding bones, we're the kind of people that wind up getting phone calls if and when anybody identifies or discovers things like an archaeological site, or for those of us that go out and do field work in paleontology, looking for ancient human remains or the archaeological remains from people from the past. Somebody like me can look at these bones and be able to identify, first of all, if it's human or non-human, and then from there to try and do more in-depth analysis of what those particular bones can tell us about an individual from the broadest biological perspective, as in, is it a young person or an old person? Is it a male or a female? The more subtle aspects of existence and society, where the bones of an individual may tell you something about the lives they live. So because I've been working at the museum, at the Yale University Laboratories, I also help out the Yale Peabody Museum with identification and assessment of skeletal material there. And prior to coming to Connecticut to work here, I was at the Smithsonian, where I also provided support in looking at skeletal material for the same purposes, trying to identify and describe the things that are visible on these bones. So I've been providing this as kind of a service and a support for scientists and other personnel as necessary should any bones be discovered or identified.
Hey, Gary, Scott here.
Go ahead, Scott.
I know that on I know that on several of the projects you've worked on, here in Connecticut at least, you wanted no information about the skeletal material that came to you as far as where it might have been found or the context. Is that a kind of a standard way to operate, or is it something that you just prefer? And can you tell us what you think that adds to your analysis?
That's a great question, Scott. Thank you. No, in general, we do try to make sure that we maintain a relatively independent assessment. This is especially important for something like a forensic case. As you might imagine, when you're involved in a situation where an individual may have been discovered and a possible crime has been committed, scientific evaluation provides an objective and independent assessment of evidence. And so, even in cases where yourself or Sarah or any community member or scientist or law enforcement may find a set of bones, it's important to set aside whatever narratives might either exist or even the hypotheses or questions involved. Because for somebody like myself, it would be critical for me to provide a very solitary and expertise-driven analysis of what the bones themselves describe. And a simple explanation of example I can give is that should you have a situation or scenario where an individual says, oh, so-and-so is a great Viking king or warrior, a man of great prestige, a recent analysis has just come out where a set of remains have had what appeared to be male or gender material in place up in Scandinavia. Actually wound up being a female skeleton. A great example of showing how you need to look at each piece of evidence, each line of evidence, relatively independent from the others, so that way you can get kind of each line of evidence to see if they either conflict or if they complement each other, which again provides a more balanced and structured narrative for the case as a whole.
Thank you.
So I guess just to give some context on this project, it involves skeletons that were unearthed from a cemetery that has been largely forgotten and kind of lost to history after the gravestones were moved. And this is something that actually turns out to be fairly common. Graves are found oftentimes during construction projects and things like that. And then it turns out that they're actually part of cemeteries that have been lost to modern memory because of the fact that, over time, churches moved, cemeteries filled up and they stopped using them. They removed the gravestones to kind of just make the landscape look nicer. And these burials are all around us. So it's kind of the same situation here with the Yale-New Haven 4 project. So can you give us a little bit of background on the project, how it was found, what was found, and then how you got involved?
Sure. And I have to certainly reiterate the point that this particular research has been published and it is available in an open access scientific journal. And this is done explicitly so community members here in Connecticut, people all around the world have the opportunity to read about and learn about this particular case. So I encourage those listening and more interested in the case, they can certainly go and read the paper itself. It's also important to recognize that this research, and I know this is something that the State Archaeology Office is always part of, this isn't just a bunch of scientists in ivory towers kind of working on their own. This was very much a project that was community-driven and involved citizen scientists and local advocates that really made a difference. And that's kind of how the story starts. We pointed out the history of the case in brief, but the Yale-New Haven emergency room is undergoing renovation and expansion. And on a Friday, a construction worker has been working his backhoe, dug a trench, and left for the weekend. Hopefully had a really good weekend. It rained that weekend when they came back Monday morning and prepared to go back and keep working on the trench. A single human skeletal element was visible sticking out of the side of the trench because the rain had kind of washed the dirt. As you would expect and as it's necessary and protocol driven, law enforcement was then called in. Following that, we would be ascertaining that it was a historic versus a crime scene. The state archaeologist at the time, this was Nick Bellantoni, was called in the scene. And as you pointed out, Nick and I have worked on other projects as well. Most importantly, one of the personnel involved in this and one of the co-authors on this study is a guy named Tony Grigo. Tony Grigo is ex-New Haven PD and was working as a security guard and is, I wouldn't call him an amateur historian, I'd call him a straight-up historian. He was aware of the history of that landscape under the Yale-New Haven Hospital and was one of the people that immediately kind of clued us in that there might be more here than meets the eye than an initial discovery. Upon starting the excavation and having the opportunity, and we're very grateful that the New Haven Hospital provided us the time to do so, we were able to start excavating and identify this one individual. But as Sarah and Scott and several others who work in archaeology often find, as we began excavating a single individual, another individual became visible in the excavated dirt. Following this, yet another individual was exposed, and by the time the fourth individual was exposed at this time, that was kind of the cue for all personnel involved to be like, if we keep going, we don't know when or how we stop. So we made our best efforts to try and recover as many of the four individuals from that space using the best archaeological techniques, photography, and documentation.
So three of the skeletons actually were stacked right on top of each other with their burials?
That is correct, and my understanding from Nick Bellantoni, as well as reading historical archives about cemeteries and things, is that cemetery is real estate and land is land, and on occasion, on more than one occasion, individuals can be stacked up within a single grave site. And so that certainly seems to have been the case with those three individuals. They were immediately adjacent to each other, one immediately atop of the other.
So would that sort of suggest that they were probably buried around the same time? Or do you think that there was a lag? No?
Yeah, that's a really tough question to answer. Some of the ways we can get at that kind of answer is to see if there are any artifact-based or contextual data that might be associated with that in terms of things like do the soil profiles within the burial shaft over there showing signs of differences, or do you find a certain kind of artifact in the best possible world, a coin with a date on it in one grave at the bottom and a coin with another date at the top. You know, that would be the absolute best case. In this particular scenario, all individuals were buried in caskets because we were able to recover the coffin nails and fragments of wood. And they were also buried with shrouds because very small shroud pins were also present. These are kind of consistent with 19th century mortuary practices. And the only artifact that we were able to recover aside from the mortuary hardware was a single fragment of a rosary. And this fragment we were very hopeful would tell us more about construction or location or a particular saint. Regrettably, the copper alloy it was made of pretty badly damaged, but you can clearly see stamped onto it the word saint and some radiating lines from the center, probably indicating like a heart or something. But unfortunately, without any other artifacts, it's kind of hard to tell if there's time consistency among those remains or distance.
So, who was involved in excavating the burials? Was it, I mean, it seemed like at the trench it was a pretty tight space, but you said it was kind of a community effort. Did you have volunteers working out there?
We did, and it's a sign of excellence and a badge of honor, I think, for the State Archaeologist Office and for the Friends of the State Archaeologist and for Connecticut people in general. Nick was remarkably blessed by the fact that he had a group of high school students that were doing like an internship. And for those of us that have done archaeology for a long time, these kids had literally just started with him that morning, and the very first job they had was in the excavation of a series of human skeletons. I was slightly nervous about it just because of the fact that, any artifact is delicate, but bones can be particularly so. But these kids did a truly remarkable job. We also had support by Amanda Lee, currently a graduate student at Yale University, but she was a student at Southern Connecticut State University, as well as Dawn Brown, who also works at the office relatively often, and Yukiko Tsunolike, who is also a research associate at Yale. So while it was a relatively small space, given the amount of time we had to make sure to work on it. I also want to make sure to mention, and I'll talk more about them in a bit, a friend of the State Archaeologist, his name was, Howard Eckel, who was also there and provided photography and documentation of the scene at the time.
Yeah, it's really great and important that we can get all these people involved in these types of projects because they often have such tight timelines and such limited budgets, and there's a lot of pressure. So it's just an invaluable resource for helping to get these things taken care of. So after the burials were excavated and back at the lab, what is your process for analyzing them? Can you kind of just walk us through what you do with them when you get them back to the lab?
Absolutely. Excuse me. And so, for many of your listeners who might be familiar with it, and for those who may not be, when burials are discovered or when human remains are recovered, context and identity is very important. Many of your listeners might be aware that Native American skeletal remains, funerary objects, and sites are protected by federal law. And so the ability to do any kind of analysis on remains requires both permission and authorization. In this particular instance, on the outset of the analysis, it came very much into the question of, okay, we can provide a basic osteological or bone-based analysis of these individuals, and then prepare them for return and burial. However, other options exist for human remains, regardless of their context and location, provided the preservation is in relatively good state. And the shortest example I can give you about this would be that every single one of us in the world goes through the same evolutionary, biological, and physiological growth process. And so your teeth inside of your head are developing at a very steady rate because you're a human being, and that's the rate that your teeth will develop in. And your teeth will have and reflect aspects of their bone chemistry, of the soil and the food chemistry from which they came from. So isotopic analyses of dentition can provide a far more nuanced set of information about a person, even beyond some of the basic osteological analyses that someone like myself can do, looking at things like sex and age, etc. Also, inside of teeth, if preservation has allowed it, you know that your teeth are relatively, they're basically rocks inside of your mouth, but inside of those teeth, tissues can be preserved. And so it's possible to open up the tooth, and if you're fortunate, you'll be able to extract and remove DNA from that person, from the tooth itself, and then analyze that to provide more detailed information about that person's sex, ethnicity, and other aspects of their identity. So what wound up happening is we had a discussion of what's possible to learn more about who these people were. While I appreciate that some of the work that I can do with bones and teeth are interesting, they're relatively finite. These other methods and techniques of analysis can provide a larger set of data about the developmental history of the person. Again, aspects of ethnicity and identity through genetic analyses are far more effective and nuanced than what somebody like myself can do looking at bones alone. So once we were able to secure permission that we could do these additional analyses to provide more information about who these people were, we start out in the laboratory with cleaning and then laying out the skeletal elements basically on a table in the same as you would have somebody in a morgue, so we can identify and describe each individual element, then kind of work our way through identifying the age, the sex, any indications of pathologies of injury, and then again selecting elements and tissue and other components that may be able to be used for kinetic or isotopic analysis. While that's happening, and especially in this particular case, we were also working with a local historian, and a name that I think some of your colleagues might be familiar with is Dan DeLuca, well known for his research and work on the Leatherman here in Connecticut. But Dan, Howard Eccles, and Ronald Weissowitz, the professor at Central Connecticut State University, all worked to go through archival material, maps, and other kinds of things to try and pull together on their end a collection of information about the context and kind of spatial and time-based analysis of where these people were buried, while the rest of us were working on these biological, isotopic or genetic analysis.
So, can you tell us a little bit about what you found out from the first step from the skeletal analyses? What that was able to tell you about these individuals?
Yeah, and so the main advantage we had is that these remains were in relatively complete condition. So, in other words, sometimes you can find a burial or stone material, and it can be a single tooth or a single foot element. And when that happens, we're very limited in our ability of describing or identifying that person. Here, many of these skeletons were relatively complete. Some of the skulls and dentition, while having some damage, were in good enough shape that we were able to identify and evaluate them using the scientific methods that I was taught in my lab, and then I work with my students and teach them as well. So of the 4 people that were identified, the 4 individuals were 2 men and 2 women, all of them round about middle age. And of the 4, several of them had some interesting pathologies, or what I like to call life history markers. And I guess the simplest way I can explain something like that would be, for any member of the listening community or any one of us talking right now, some of us may have made some poor decisions or had an accident or done something where a bone or tooth may be injured. When I'm in class or when I'm talking to students, I usually talk about the fact that my right pinky has a damaged knuckle from poor decisions I made as a teenager in Brooklyn. This finger is still broken, and I never had the knuckle set, so the bone is fused and set in an unusual pattern. And bone is alive for an individual's existence, and these bones and these cracks and pits or damage can really tell us about something like that happened to me, or something that happened to people in the past. So many of the individuals show markers on their joints, on the places where muscles attach to the bone that indicates that they were most likely engaging in strenuous labor relatively often. Other individuals show potential indications of an estrogen deficiency. In other words, what appears to be a case of early menopause. And again, this can't be identified through a blood test or an analysis like that because all we have are these bones. But the characteristics of the bones of this particular woman were consistent with available medical reports as well as other recorded cases of estrogen deficiency syndrome in other human skeletons in other parts of the world. And so all of these bones and all of the features of these individuals seem to coalesce around a similar existence, that those individuals all seem to show markers of strenuous labor, of presence of chronic illnesses or chronic issues that, again, we were working with the historians, were able to kind of look at these skeletal markers and then compare those kind of with socioeconomic and situation of the Catholic Church that existed there in the mid-19th century.
What kind of evidence, I mean, so you talked about, evidence of the type of labor that people did, repetitive, hard labor and things like that. What kinds of injuries did you find on some of these individuals?
Well, an individual I have the greatest respect for was the individual that we identified as individual B3, a relatively older man, 50s to early 60s, with a whole series of fractures, including a set of fractures that went along the rear aspect of his left rib cage, evidence of a sealed fractured jaw, a depressed fracture on his skull that indicates some kind of injury. Can't necessarily say the cause of it was, but he definitely had gotten hit in the head at some point. Markers of gout, which is a concentration of uric acid that kind of builds up in the joint and can actually lead to some erosion or changes in joint surfaces. And a very serious case of what can be called osteomyelitis, kind of a chronic infection in the lower leg of this same individual. So simply put, for one individual, there's this extraordinary set of medical issues, any one of which I certainly would be complaining bitterly about, no matter how old I was. And it really shows the resilience as well as the stresses that people at this time period were having to deal with.
What about the teeth? What did they tell you about people's dental health?
That's a really great question. And the most interesting or important thing is that, as you might imagine, I talked to you about the teeth as being little rocks inside of your mouth. In the fossil record, these are among the most common things that we can find. And for those of you interested in paleontology, you know, if you go looking for dinosaur bones or shark teeth and things like that, or if you go work in Africa or anywhere else in the world looking for fossils, teeth are pretty much the most common thing to find because they're already basically stone in your mouth, and then the fossilization process allows them to kind of hang around for stuff. So analysis of teeth is among the most common and most important kind of starting points. And teeth can tell us a lot of different things. One of the things I can tell you is as teeth are developing, lines of enamel, again, are laid in a very specific repetitive pattern because of our evolutionary biology. But if there's an energetic stressor for a child, either in utero or later in their developmental period, as your teeth are forming inside of your maxilla or mandible, inside of your jaw, your body, your physiology, your evolutionary ecology basically says, look, I need a certain amount of energy to feed my brain. And so as energy is either coming in or not enough energy is coming in, your physiology, your development as a child will say, okay, we're going to put energy where they need it, which is usually in brain and body growth. It will actually lead to a loss of enamel layers, either in thickness or in size, in the condition of a developing child. So in other words, when you guys look in the mirror and check your teeth out tonight, you'll probably notice that your teeth are kind of like surfaces of glass. They're smooth, they're in good shape because you can tissue, so that you have a good nutritional and energetically effective life. For many people around the world today, and for this particular set of individuals in this case, they were struggling with either nutritional, energetic, or possibly infectious disease stresses during development. So you get what are called linear enamel hyperplasia, or small pits or lines into that indicate that there was some period of time or succession of periods where enamel is not being laid down, because again, the body has to send energy to other parts of your body during development. So linear enamel hyperplasias were present in all of the individuals we examined here, indicating that they can undergo stresses during development. And another thing we look at are aspects of dental wear. Your teeth wear down over time. The stronger or grittier foods you chew, the more your teeth may show signs of being worn very heavily. These individuals didn't have a lot of wear, so their teeth kind of look like our teeth in terms of the wear pattern. But these individuals also had two other problems. One was cavities, relatively expected when you consider 19th century people eating a lot of sugary foods or sticky foods, so you're going to want to cavities. But they also have this remarkable substance that wound up building up on the teeth that we call plaque, or the dentists call it plaque. We, in our community, call it dental calculus. And the dental calculus is really critical for a simple reason. It captures your oral bacteria. All of us have bacteria in mouths. It's really important to have it. But that oral bacteria can also be useful to try and tell us more about the health and condition of the individual during the period of that calculus development. So simply put, these individuals not only had indications of developmental stressors, not only did they have this dental calculus that had preserved some aspects of their oral health, but they also, each and every individual, had worn canines and worn incisors on one side of their mouth. And the reason for this appears to me that all individuals were smoking ceramic pipes. Many of you might be familiar with these. Pipe smoking has been a tradition for most people around the world. Ceramic pipes certainly were cheap, easy to get, and really common to have. But the ceramic can actually erode and remove parts of your enamel. So again, all four of these individuals show a small circle or ring at the location where their canines and their incisors were used on the one side.
It's really interesting. Is the fact that it was all on the one side, does it suggest they were all the same handed?
That was a great question. I'm afraid I'm not quite that good. My recollection is that everybody had them on the left side of their mouth. So on one level, I think that's kind of indicative on one side. I'm afraid to say I'm not a smoker and I've never been a pipe smoker, so I'm not sure which side of my mouth I'd be gripping my pipe.
That's really interesting, though, that they all had those marks.
And I don't recommend anybody experiment with that either. So no smoking.
And it's kind of interesting because corollary to that is we occasionally find clay pipe stems in deposits that have the teeth marks still on them. So kind of the yin to that yang.
Absolutely. And again, I think that really reiterates that point that, what I'm able to identify or describe from the skeleton, again, has correlated, can be correlated with very specific aspects of artifacts or materials that archaeologists recover. And again, it's that connection between our disciplines that's so important to, check ourselves against what we see.
Yeah, it's really interesting, too, to correlate that with just the idea of working class kind of laboring people and smoking these pipes, because we learned that in the 19th century, the pipes kind of do get shorter and stubbier, so people can kind of clamp them between their teeth and smoke them while they're working with their hands. And it is kind of a working class marker, which I think is really kind of characterizes this whole cemetery and the people that you found there. Was there any other injuries or aspects of the skeletal anatomy that stood out?
Well, there was an interesting situation with one individual, and so it's kind of a corollary to it. I mentioned we had done analyses of genetics and isotopic analyses. And I do encourage you guys to take a look at the research paper, but the short version of it is 3 of the 4 individuals largely show very similar kind of genetic signatures and isotopic signatures, all indicating that they're not from the United States. And the way we can evaluate or identify this is that the isotopes of dentition, the isotopes of teeth, can be compared, in essence, to soil profiles for different regions in the world. We compare to the soil because the plants you eat, in the past at least, pretty much come from the local farms that you grew up in. And so if you didn't grow up here, like I grew up in Brooklyn, and ate local foods in Brooklyn when I was a kid, somebody from Washington State, same age as me, same country, same economic status, but somebody eating vegetables in Washington State, the isotope signatures are not quite the same as they might be in Connecticut, or in New Mexico, or in Cuba, or in China. And so scientists have long been collecting data on the different soil signatures. And when dentition is recovered, looking at these isotopic signatures can help to correlate or at least provide some geographic assessment or correlation. And in the instance of the YNH4, of the Yale-New 4, 3 of these individuals show a similar isotopic signature in their dentition that indicates they were not from the New England area. A 4th individual, again, shows a signature that's not the same as ours in this part of the country. But this 4th individual also had a pretty remarkable skeletal issue. And the issue was that multiple neck vertebrae, or the little spine that goes from your head to your shoulders, showed a series of fractures and cracks that didn't match up with damage from excavation or damage from being put into a coffin or dirt landing on it and then cracking it. In other words, none of the damage appeared to be post-mortem. Instead, the fracture pattern seems relatively consistent with what we call a peri-mortem event, or an event after around the time of death. I mentioned my damaged finger that had a break. Well, bone heals if it has the time to do so. This individual has fractured neck vertebrae that appear to have occurred at or around the time of death. It's suggested that this is a form of trauma. Now, identifying the source and the cause of the trauma is difficult in any circumstance, especially in the absence of any other data. We went through and looked at the available cemetery records, and this again reiterates how important a historical record is. And we were able to find in the city records for the Catholic cemetery names of individuals, ages of individuals, and in many cases there was list a cause of death in those archives. And these archives, anyone can look these up. The best thing about the internet, in my opinion, is that there's so many things available now that people like myself, or historians, would have spent months in libraries and city archives. Again, my colleagues, Dan, Howie, Ron, they went through and found all of these different archives and scoured through and found indications of middle-aged men who had died from accidental injuries, from falls. But one particular individual struck us where an individual was publicly executed in New Haven at the courthouse in October of 1850. This individual was convicted of murder in a case that happened on East Rock in New Haven. Believe it or not, East Rock used to have a hotel in the building. The owners were brutally murdered. A man named James McCaffrey had fit the description and also had evidence that was found to be enough to convict him of the crime. And McCaffrey was hung in 1850 at the New Haven courthouse. He was then buried in the Catholic cemetery because this particular individual was an Irish Catholic. We offered the hypothesis that this individual B2, potentially could be James McCaffrey because the neck fracture pattern is consistent with the kinds of injuries you see in a judicial hanging. But like any good scientific question, all of my attempts to try and confirm or support this hypothesis that a specific set of neck fractures from hanging always looks like X pattern. Other researchers before me have shown that while we appreciate there to be a regular consistent pattern, that's not necessarily always the case. At the time, we provisionally identified this individual with a neck fracture as potentially being Mr. McCaffrey, who was executed in hanging. But we're hoping that as further evidence, more analyses may confirm or support that hypothesis in that identity.
Hey, I do want to just jump in for a second and thank John for writing in. There was one comment he had, which you just responded to, not knowing that he had written in. He asked whether there was any more work on confirming the identity of the skeleton attributed to McCaffrey. So you're a step ahead of John there. But he also wrote in a separate note, in the last exhibit in the September 2019 paper on the burial excavations, I am 99 to 100% sure those shown in the diagram of the census form are from Ireland and not Poland. This is comparing what was written, which was also Ireland, but clearer penmanship, and their surnames, which were very Irish. Anyway, he wanted to offer that input as well.
No, and that's a critical and another difficult question that we were trying to evaluate and ascertain. Our initial hypothesis and our functional hypothesis was that all of these individuals would be of Irish descent. As many of our listeners are aware, the 1840s is a period where the Irish migration to America was at its height. This church, and it's one of the most interesting things that came out of this study, was part of this amazing effort to try and find all these Catholic churches, the dates of the origins of Catholic churches in New Haven. As a New Haven, West Haven resident myself, I ride or drive by these churches all the time and think about their ancient history. However, the genetic analysis, as I pointed out before, that was conducted by my colleague Lawrence Schmidt. We had an expectation that their genomic sequence would match up with being of Irish descent. And the sequences of Irish and Irish American people are available in these national and international data. However, these three individuals, not Mr. McCaffrey, but the other three individuals I described before, their genetic sequencing did not show a high degree of similarity with Irish people. It's a little bit murky because, again, they are individuals from the past, and it's difficult to say that a genetic sequence explicitly associates with one ethnicity and another. But our working hypothesis became that because these individuals showed a stronger genetic affinity, similarity to individuals of Central or Southern European descent, And it's possible, and this is something that Ramal, the Central Connecticut State University professor, and the rest of our history team really dove into, all of Europe was struggling in the 1830s to the 1850s with a lot of political difficulty, a lot of conflict, and a lot of people were moving all over the place. Our paper posits that because individuals show a relatively different population affinity than Irish, and their isotopic signatures do not show the similar characteristics that we see in Irish and United English residents, we posited that these individuals may be either Polish, Prussian, or some other European descent. This presents another interesting question of, well, why are they in that cemetery? And it became an interesting question that at that time period, the place you're buried and the people you're buried with, the religion matters a lot. I think some of it was true today, but certainly at that time period, it may have been inclusive cut up with components. That church is one of the only Catholic churches in the New Haven area. So I suggest in the paper that because some of the biological data suggests that these may not have been individuals with Irish descent, their Catholic identity and their Catholic existence is far more important than their ethnic identity. And so we see this in several different references to the Catholic history in the United States. Early Catholic history shows that a lot of people are congregating in the churches. There were very few Catholics in the early part of American history. And as Catholics begin to explode in our country through immigration, through a variety of things, you also start to find the expansion and the diversification of churches. And here in New Haven, I'm able to, or we were able to, look at the development of St. Boniface, the German Catholic Church in the later part of the 19th century. St. Stanislaus, the Polish community, the Italian community. In other words, after a period of early Catholic investment in the United States, or in New Haven in particular, as more and more locals are coming in, we see churches becoming ethnically segregated, still Catholic, but you see more of this distinction in both ethnic or national and religious identity. And the 1840 period would suggest that this Catholic identity superseded an aspect of either an ethnic identity. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, you know what I'd like to say, just jump in here for a minute and say that I think that this conversation in particular of all our shows, I think so far has been very illuminating to some of our listeners who haven't been involved in this kind of research and showing how you start with hypothesis and then you let the evidence and the study take you in a different direction, and sometimes it takes you pretty far away from what you initially thought. So I think that's kind of important for people to understand how that process works.
Absolutely.
Well, we're getting close to winding down. We wanted to make sure that we could get some final thoughts, but also get around the round table and make sure everybody's aware of what FOSA is all about. Scott, you want to let people know about FOSA, what you guys, the mission and mandate, how people can get involved, and as Gary's talking about citizen scientists, FOSA is a great way. FOSA membership is a great way for citizens to be involved in the science.
Yeah, basically what FOSA is, it's the Friends of the Office of State Archaeology. We support the Office of State Archaeology, both financially and through assistance, generally speaking, volunteers. So our volunteers will work in the lab, they'll work out in the field performing excavations, and a whole host of other tasks. And that's kind of our mission in supporting the Office of State Archaeology, we support the preservation of Connecticut's archaeological heritage. You can reach us at fosa-ct.org. We also have a Facebook page you can find us on, and we'd be happy for anyone who has an interest in participating to reach out to us. I'd just like to add one thing. When we first informed our membership about this topic, Bruce Green reached out to me. Bruce Green, for those of you that don't know Bruce, was Nick's right-hand man and a FOSA volunteer. And he was talking about when they got to the site, one of the things that happened almost immediately was the Catholic Church sent a priest and a nun out. This sounds like the start of a bad joke, but it isn't. Because the skeletal remains were found, they knew they were associated with the church. And the construction foreman required them to wear hard hats while they went down into the trench and offered the appropriate Christian blessings in their full Catholic regalia in hard hats. So you really can't make this stuff up. And if you want to be a FOSA volunteer, that's something that you don't see every day, and you may get a chance to see it.
Hey, Scott, are you guys, is there anything that you're working on presently? Are there projects that are happening in the first quarter of 2021?
Well, we've had a few projects through the fall. The weather's starting to look a little bit colder. We were working at Prudence Crandall Museum with Sarah for a little while. We're hoping that with the vaccine and we kind of have a good feeling on how to manage COVID requirements, that as the spring starts, we can get back to a more regular schedule of getting people out in the field with us.
And Gary, can you share with people how they can find, follow, and be part of all things that you're working on, and what takes up your time currently?
Absolutely. So the first thing I want to big shout out to Bruce. I'm glad to hear that he's up there. And I do want to reiterate very much what Scott and Sarah are pointing out. To me, you're not citizen scientists. You are scientists. And this work can't happen without the vested interest and engagement of every member of the community. And I can promise you, both from working with students, they're doing this for a living in a variety of different contexts, both academic and as archaeological contractors. But there's going to be some weird kid somewhere in Connecticut who's just like me, that this is going to wind up being something that they want to do for the rest of their lives. And I encourage all family members, I encourage all people near and far, get involved and get into this kind of work, because it's not the easiest job, but I can't think of anything more rewarding. And all I tell my kids is that I never go to bed bored, because every day there's some new discovery, there's some new technique, there's some new method coming in. In terms of work that is ongoing, yes, I've been working very closely with Nick, with Scott, with the other sets of skeletal remains that have been excavated at the same processes, the same work that I'm talking about here. We're slowly and methodically working our way through to provide as much of this, these twists and turns of this complex history that require this multidisciplinary effort by community members, by scientists, from national and international level. So yeah, there will be more work that we'll be discussing soon. COVID, unfortunately, took a chunk out of all of our lives, but definitely slowed down a lot of our research.
And Sarah, how about letting everybody know what's going on in your office and how people can find and follow you?
Yeah, you can follow us. I have a website through UConn at osa.uconn.edu, and the Office of State Archaeology Facebook page. I'm looking at getting an Instagram page up and running this spring as well. And we're working on some ongoing projects, including the Hollister site that we've talked about on this project before, and some other things that are going to just, kind of naturally come up. But just to reiterate what Scott and Gary were talking about, I mean, the Office of State Archaeology is a one-person state agency. We could not do the work that needs to be done in this state without the help of volunteers and interested just members of the community. So please, if you're interested, contact BOTA and find out about signing up and joining us. You never know what kind of exciting experiences you might have.
And we couldn't do this program if it hadn't been powered by FOSA. So we want to put in our thanks for them as well. We encourage anybody who has a question or wants to get in touch with anyone and didn't jot anything down, just send us a note and we'll connect the dots. Send it to info@icrvradio.com. That's info@icrvradio.com. Got to thank everybody. Gary, thanks for joining us. Scott, as always. Sarah, as always, thanks so much for being part of ICRV Radio.
Thanks for listening, everybody.
Thanks.
Happy New Year.